The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again. Another great episode of Genesis is coming up. Today we got author Dave Jordan, who wrote a book with former Major League Baseball player John D'Acquisto, and it's pretty much on John D'Acquisto's life in a great book, which has been compared to Booten's Ball 4. And let me tell you, Fastball John is on deck today, and we're going to get to the book. We're going to get to David, and we're going to talk a little bit about publishing. We're going to talk a little bit about the book itself, and another ride going through the 1970s, just when we had David Epstein on the show and talking about big hair and plastic grass, and then the summer of 76. And he even commented on this, that this is a great book. And let me tell you something, folks. The holidays are coming up. This podcast won't be published probably for another 2 to 3 weeks. It's going to be Halloween tomorrow. So by the time this is published and you folks will be hearing this, the holidays are coming around. This is a definite. You go to Amazon, you go to, anywhere, any bookstore should have this, and go get it, because this is a keeper for anyone who's a baseball fan. It should be under your tree, under the menorah, whatever holiday you celebrate, and these days you never know, this book is good to get. You are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I always give deference to my producer, Ralph Tycho, the Zigzag Man. And when you deal with the Zigzag Man, it's he's just created something that's so great. We got Peter Golenbach in Golenbach's University. We got Hal Bach in Vintage Sports. We got Bill Kashatis in Philadelphia doing the whole sports baseball from past, present, and future, and that includes Negro Leagues and, of course, that other Philadelphia team that's now residing in Oakland, the Athletics. Hey, we got Nancy Philly out in Oakland, and of course she is Denise, self-proclaimed. He's actually probably second cousin to Charlie O, but she gives the perspective of growing up with those swinging A's, and so we are delighted to have her. We have Mark Littell and Mark Weiss, Mark in the midday, and you know something? Mark Littell is great, he is known as the guy who gave up the home run to Chris Chambliss. And, when that happened in October of 76, it propelled the Yankees to go to the World Series the first time in 12 years. And that's in 1964 when they lost to the St. Louis Cardinals in 7 games. And you know something? He is an all-around class act. Funny, jovial, and he brings great guests to the network, and it's just a fun show. Tune into the network. Of course, I'm on the show with Genesis, and I also used to be on with Dave Nemec and Alan Blumpkin, and now that football season is over for my kids, I might be rejoining them on Dave Nemec's old-time baseball and trivia. Also, tune into Giants Baseball with Ralph Tycho, and you'll realize, hey, there was a whole history in New York before they became the San Francisco Giants. But that's about that for the network. But, D'Acquisto over here, he was named the National League Rookie Pitcher of the year 1974. He pitched in the major leagues for 10 seasons, and if you never heard of him, you're going to hear of him tonight, mostly for the San Francisco Giants and the Padres. Now remember, Johnny was brought up there in San Diego, and those people out in California, man, they like their warm weather. So the good thing about one of the eye-popping things is he was named as one of the fastest pitches ever by Bill James. His fastball was recorded at 102.4 miles per hour. Now, Johnny works as a replay tech and field timing coordinator for Major League Baseball's Federal Trade Commission and replay tech programs from MajorLeagueBaseball.com, Major League Baseball Network, near his home now in Phoenix, Arizona. And Dave Jordan, who is joining us tonight, is the founder of InStream Sports, the first athlete-author website home to the highly acclaimed first-person essays from many Hall of Fame and popular athletes. David's work has been praised by writers at NBC Sports, ESPN, Grantland, Sports Illustrated, Deadspin, and SB Nation. He has also written, directed, and produced films and commercials, including the SXSW Festival hit The Paper Mache Cheese, starring Jim Gaffigan, Cynthia Nixon, and Spalding Gray. And without any further ado, welcome to the show, Dave.
Ian, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, we're going to have a great time. What a wonderful book. I mean, I said it in the intro. When I did my homework on you, I listened to the podcast of Mets 360, Talking Baseball. How long did it take you and John to even decide to write it, and then write it, research it, and put it out?
Oh, well, we were working on some pieces for In-Stream Sports, and we'd gotten a ton of accolades for our work, and moreover for Johnny's stories. I mean, he's the consummate storyteller, and he at a certain point he said to me that I want to tell my stories, and I said, well, we've been telling you stories, and he says, no, I want to tell my story, and I kind of know how difficult it is to break through in the publishing business, and I was a little skittish about doing this because I wanted to do it right, and I wanted Johnny to get the proper platform. And he said, well, I need to tell my story now. It's time. I didn't tell it enough the first time. I need to tell it now. So it took some convincing, but at a certain point I said, you know what? I'm here to do it. We've done all these stories. It doesn't make any sense for you to, do it with anyone else. So we started, talking about some more stories and got deep into, what he went through in his life. And I flew out to Arizona, and I spent a week with him, and we really got down to the nitty-gritty of everything and he went through. And after that, we started writing the first draft of the manuscript, and that took about maybe 2 or 3 months. And then we just started working on it and honing down where we wanted it to be, and then we just started going and trying to get it out there for him.
Now, let me ask you this. When you see, like I discussed with you off the show, and many of my listeners know that I'm trying to publish my manuscript on the whole type Speaker. And when I'm running up his luck, you got some baseball publishing companies that put out hundreds of baseball books, and then you get others and all the profits and all the contracts and all the copyright and all this other stuff. I wanted to be special. I know you wanted this to be special. Just because when you read it, and if people think that 560-something pages is a lot of pages, this book is so well put together, so edited well, that it took me only like a couple of days to finish it. How did you bypass all the publishing companies, make the decision, hey, I'm going to publish this, and literally hone in on almost every detail, every facet of Johnny's life?
Well, it turned out that, we had a number of publishing companies that we'd spoken with, from the very top to middle tier companies, and we ran into some interference a number of times. And it's just, this is my first real book, my first published book, and Johnny, there were a lot of people that had said, well, we've never really heard of Johnny. We definitely haven't heard of Dave Jordan, so. We were told at 4 of the major publishers that we kind of, quote unquote, died in the marketing meeting. I mean, you have the editors who love the book, and then they bring it into the marketing meeting where the marketing department says, well, how are we going to sell this? And we had a number of editors come back and say, look, we really love this, but, excuse me, you're not the book you're not the island that we can die on, which is, I can understand. I understand how mercurial that industry can be. So, and then we had a couple of other smaller publishers who said, look, this book is great, but we need a 300-page book. We don't need a 500-page book. And we don't necessarily like the title Fastball John. And we don't really like the design of the cover. We have our own cover artists. We have other thoughts on different titles. And at a certain point, we knew about the Amazon option, and we were just like, we want to do this our way. And a lot of the folks that wanted to make all these changes, when we asked about what was their marketing plan, they said, well, you're going to have to come up with, Johnny's going to have to leverage his contacts and whatnot. And at a certain point, we said, well, why don't we, if these are your contacts and a few of my contacts, and they don't really have any contacts besides a couple nominal radio show guys, why don't we just do this ourselves? And Johnny was like, he kind of wanted that freedom to begin with. So at a certain point, we all got on the same page, and we just decided to go it ourselves.
And you know something? I was going to mention, I love that cover because that's Johnny with the blue and red, and that's just like bang, Major League Baseball with Steve Garvey on the cover. And when people see that, hey, this is a great thing, great marketing thing for Fastball Johnny.
Yeah,
Huh?
I mean, I wanted something that was iconic, and I didn't want it to be like any other book where it'd be like Fastball John and, you know, Mac and Bobby and Mercer and all the giant. We didn't want some cheesy subtitle. We wanted people to know this is Fastball John, and that was kind of our goal. And what else we did was we wanted to write it as if it was sort of a literary prestige cable series where people would get up Sunday morning, have their cup of coffee, and just read a chapter a week, and then put it down, and just once a week they would enjoy the book over an extended period of time, rather than, I know everybody's binging TV series now, and they don't, you know, traditionally watch a show once a week, but I kind of wanted that sensation. That I wanted it serialized, I wanted it episodic, and Johnny and I talked about it, and he thought that was such a great idea, that it's as cinematic as it is literary, and that's kind of how we thought about putting it together.
And you know what struck me as well? I'm a big music guy. Okay, now I'm huge in music, and the way that this reads, you know, when you read about Johnny, he has something on the radio, and it brings back a memory. The chapters are always labeled by something in the 70s, like no one knows what the Midnight Special is, you know, or was, you know, Mahogany. That was a movie with Diana Ross. Do you know what was that song? Do you know where you're going
to? Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm reading this, and I'm like, wow, man, you're bringing back stuff of my time that I remember when I was just, well, hey, you're my age, you know. Yep. It's just how, you know, and Johnny, I think, he had a band also. His love of
He did. He certainly did. Opened for Chuck Berry.
Yeah. And Berry died last year, I think, right? He died last year.
Chuck sad day, you know. But, you know, it was, but there was more to it than that. I mean, I realized that so many people, when you hear a song you haven't heard for 2 decades, it brings you back to that last moment you heard it. So I thought of that as sort of an interview device. And we didn't really say, like, all right, Johnny, when was the last time you heard Satisfaction? You might have heard it 3 hours ago on Sirius XM. But I wanted to know, like, when was the last time you heard Brandy? That could have been 10 or 15 years ago. When was the last time you heard My Maria? That might have been 30 years ago. You know, Hamilton Joe, when was the last time you know, Don't Pull Your Love? When was the last time you heard that song? So I wanted to find these songs, and I would send them to Johnny and say, take a listen to this song. And then he would instantly remember, oh, that was me and Aunt Tavares driving down San Mateo Boulevard in the Camaro. And then the stories would just flow from there. But, I mean, Johnny has a memory like a steel trap, which made everything so much easier. And, you know, he had stories and stories. But, you know, to add the other element of the interview device of the songs that he hasn't heard in 30 years, I mean, that really brought it to a whole other level.
And you know what's interesting? Not a lot of people know about Johnny. And so when you were first starting, hey, you know, let's get a book together, did it matter that he wasn't a superstar? I mean, he played with all the superstars, and we'll get into Juan Marichal because he's one of my favorite pitchers that pretty much get us overlooked. But when you did it, you're like, hey, I'm not talking about Willie Mays. I'm talking about a guy who was pretty much a journeyman after spending a few good seasons in the Giants and Padres and played for probably the most turbulent time period ever. But that's where it comes in. You could almost tell the life story of almost any player during this decade, and you gotta include people like Marvin Miller in there. You gotta do.
Yep.
Mays is coming to an end. Dick Williams, who again is one of my favorite managers, but again, just like Billy Martin or Manager of the Day, he had a huge mouth. And you know, when you spoke with Johnny about this and to put this down into words, you know, and his memory being so vivid or anything, did you see that he was getting emotional with any of this stuff?
There were a couple times where it got a little misty in the room, because you know, you start thinking about, you know, people you knew and people that are no longer with us, and it's heavy stuff to bring back those memories that you may not have considered or imagined in years, and to do that, you go to certain places and it's not always, it's not always a funny story about driving a car with Randy Moffat. It's about these life choices and situations he found himself in, or even, an old person that he knew from back in the day who's gone now. It's heavy time, and at times it could be a little cathartic too.
Let me ask you this about John. He started his career when he was 20. Now, it happened in the 1972 season. The first players' strike was going to happen, and Johnny was 20, and he's sitting, finding himself listening to Marvin Miller. What's going on? He asked intelligent questions for a 20-year-old.
Well, Johnny had done extremely well in school, and in addition to the football scholarships, there were some academic scholarships on the table as well. And he was all set to go to USC before the Giants had stepped in. But there's a lot of precociousness to this story, and it's not just from a sports and an athletic perspective. So he had ideas and thoughts of what was going on and happening. And yet he was different than a lot of the well-developed players that the high school athletes of today who know their worth. Back in 1972, we were all, for the most part, there weren't too many divas out there, and everybody was, throughout our entire culture, it was always, the respect for mom and dad and any authority figures, and it was very much, he knew what was out there and what was, about to approach him, but for the most part, he did definitely hold that precociousness, no question about it.
Now, growing up, he grew up in the San Diego area. What did his mother and father do for a living? And, well, his mother probably stayed home. But let me ask you this question. How was he raised? Was he in a strict family? Was it in more of a more liberal family? Because he grew up right in the 50s and into the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Watershed.
He always calls it the Italian Ozzie and Harriet. His father managed a restaurant. His mother stayed home, and it was very much, there was no yelling or screaming or hitting. They were very sweet, docile parents, but they were strict. And he knew that if they got out of line, there was a wooden spoon somewhere in that kitchen, and they weren't afraid to use it. But it was never. It was a very wonderful upbringing, is how he said it. And what you see in the book repeatedly, and it's not so much a device as his own reality, was that he always did as he was told. And he was always listening. And the fact is, when he was drafted, basically his mother was something of a de facto agent, and she handled the negotiations quite well from what he's told me.
And the cast of characters Johnny comes into, right off the bat, going back to the 1910s, 1920s, Carl Hubble. What's going on here?
Well, he was the farm director for the Giants at the time, and he had over 150 offers from colleges around the country, mainly for football, I might add. But there were a lot of schools, the teams in California definitely had their eye on Johnny's pitching, and Carl Hubble had come down to see him play during his senior year. As a matter of fact, Johnny was so stoked seeing Hubble that he threw a no-hitter that game. So that may have just absolutely sealed the deal for him.
And when you look at Johnny's story, the last time he threw a pitch was in the early 80s, in 1982. When you think about it, why do you think his story needs to be told now, almost 35 years later? Why do you think it's important?
I think it's important because we're seeing a lot of young pitchers that are aware of their value, but they don't quite get the cost of that value. And I think by seeing Johnny's journey and seeing how it can be gone in an instant, I think that young athletes reading this book can understand, hey, this guy got all the girls. This guy got all the accolades. He was treated like gold. Excuse me. And yet he was still extremely respectful to his minor league managers. And he had the free ride. The Giants basically bet the farm on him as a draft pick, and they gave him every opportunity to succeed at the minor league level, and they catered to him at the minor league level. And the wonderful thing about our book, I will say, is that you read all these books about the minor leagues and the bus rides and the lousy motels and and the 15-hour rides and the despair and the guy who's been stuck in the minor leagues making $5,000 a year for a decade or more. And Johnny's story, it was almost like college for him, and it was a great time. And he talked about having a blast with Gorman Thomas and Goose Gossage, and there's still a touch of nostalgia, especially for the folks that love baseball books, and they love not even bold-faced names, but the guys whose baseball cards would come up repeatedly when they buy rack packs. Bruce Miller or Chris Arnold or even Chris Fire, guys that you don't always hear about, but you remember from the baseball card. And it's a little like the music, that when you see a name like Cesar Cedeno and somebody Roger Metzger, it instantly brings you back to the age of 9 for a lot of these guys. And I think that appeals to most of the baseball book reading audience, at least those of a certain age.
Now, he got to see the ending of a lot of careers. We'll get into the whole Bob Gibson fiasco because that's a great story. But Juan Marichal gave him some priceless advice. What did Marichal advise to Johnny?
Told him to pitch backwards. I mean, he was not pitching. It was very funny because he had talked about Johnny wasn't sure what to do at one point. And Johnny had asked him, how do I pitch these guys? And Marichal just laughed and said, how do you pitch them? The second baseman has 35 home runs. What do you know how to pitch them? And he just basically walked him through how you handle, how you handle certain teams like this. So remember, in 1973, in Johnny's first game, he was going up against the Atlanta Braves, and they had a legendary lineup. They had 3 hitters with at least 40 home runs. You had Aaron. You had Darrell Evans and, of course, Dave, soon-to-be Davey Johnson. In addition to guys like Mike Lum and Dusty Baker had his most home runs for a while in that season. 73 was a crazy year for home runs. So Marichal just basically calmed Johnny down. And what was wonderful about all this was that Marichal was going through a terrible season. And he kind of knew in his own heart that this was his swan song in San Francisco, 1. And 2, that Johnny was going to replace him. For him to take Johnny under his wing, as he had that whole season, really spoke to the character of Juan Marichal and how he was a really, not just a great pitcher, not just a Hall of Fame baseball player, but a real human being.
And Marichal's one of my favorite pitchers, and if you read his story, they always compare him to Koufax. What people don't understand is Marichal was the winningest pitcher in the 1960s, record-wise. And they always compare him to Koufax. And they say, well, when you look at his stats, you're like, well, you don't have as many strikeouts as Koufax. And Marichal remarked, look, why do I need to get a batter out with 3 pitches when I can get him out with 1? Because basically, he was a ground ball pitcher. They could hit him, but they wouldn't get far with Marichal, especially with that high kick and not knowing where the ball's coming. So, when you talk about Marichal, and then, of course, how did he mesh with, like, Willie Mays and Willie McCovey and those guys?
Well, I don't want to spoil the McCovey story in the book, but he got along very well with McCovey. McCovey, when Johnny had his major league, spring training debut in 71, McCovey was on first base, and he was going up against the Chicago Cubs. Now, if you recall, 71, the Cubs had quite a lineup filled with Hall of Famers. You're talking Ron Santo and Billy Williams and Ernie Banks at the end of his career, as well as pesky guys like Glenn Becker, Don Kissinger. So Johnny was they were getting the best of Johnny, and McCovey stepped in and basically told Johnny how to handle it. And it's very, very interesting and almost a little funny when you see that, but McCovey took care of Johnny, and then around the mid-'70s, when McCovey was on San Diego, him and Johnny were involved with Marvin Miller, and there was some trade discussions, and there's a little part in the book on that as well. But for the most part, McCovey was great with him. Willie Mays, he played with Willie Mays in spring training 71, 72. And then May of 72 is, of course, the legendary trade to the Mets for Charlie Williams. But for the most part, Mays was very cool with him. And, the big relationship, I think that's in the book is the relationship between Johnny and Bobby Bonds. And
That's right.
We go into that. But what we also go into is the relationship between Johnny and Bobby's 10-year-old son named Barry.
And something, it's strange because, Barry, look, like I told you, I got the privilege of speaking to Brett Boone and his grandfather, Ray Boone.
Ray Boone, yep.
Always said, look, Ted Williams is the best hitter I've ever seen. Now, when Ray Boone was passing in 2004, he retracted himself and said, look, it's Barry Bonds. Now, we can go into the steroids thing. I'm not going there. But even with steroids, Barry Bonds should be considered the greatest hitter ever. Now, take that into consideration. His father was just that type of caliber player. We get that sense with Johnny. And, of course, we all know the story about Bonds with drinking and all that. But when you spoke to Johnny regarding, Bobby Bonds, did he feel that he was just on a path of self-destruction?
Well, what we talk about in the book was there's almost two Bobby Bonds. And there's the Bobby Bonds who was the loving father. There was the Bobby Bonds who was the caring husband, who loved his wife Pat and was always very respectful and very cheerful around her. But once they left the clubhouse and once he again, readers of a certain age and baseball card collectors from the 70s will remember the 74 set of all-star players. If you flip them over, on the back was a puzzle you could put together. And it was a puzzle of Bobby. And what we talk about is that there was a couple pieces missing as to putting the full picture of what was going on with Bobby. And Johnny just talked about just not quite getting what Bonds' issue could be. He was a superstar player. I mean, granted, once Willie had left, the responsibility had become Bobby Bonds and the New Giants. So he was the marquee star. And not everybody handles that the same way.
And what's interesting? He played for a lot of different managers who you mentioned today, no one even knows. I mean, Alvin Dark, he coached the Giants in the early 60s to a World Series pennant, and then later on the Oakland A's in 74 when, of course, they fired Dick Williams, who he also played with. Gene Mark, people don't even know who Gene Mark was, who was on that. He was around for about 30 years. He was on the 64 Phillies to manage that, and, of course, the Phillies self-destruct. Billy Martin comes back to Oakland. But, he names two of them. He names Charlie Fox and Roger Craig as the two managers that stand out. What do these two managers have that Johnny so admired them?
They loved him. They loved him very much. Charlie Fox had been part of the thought process and the war room, so to speak, that drafted Johnny. But he was Johnny's first manager. He was the guy who went to Mr. and Mrs. Dierquist and said, I'm going to take care of your boy. He was the guy that when Johnny was brought up from Phoenix in late August, September 1973, he was the guy who picked him up and was waiting for him at the airport. He was the guy who got him set up at the hotel, and once he got his bags packed and unpacked and whatnot, he took him out to dinner the night before his first game. He really was there. He was like a caring, affectionate uncle, and he cared about Johnny a great deal. And we try to, talk about that and we explore that, in many chapters in the book. Now, Roger Craig was, we know the stories of Roger Craig. It seems like his life's work, post-playing, was fixing pitchers. We saw what he did with Mike Scott. So however you want to explain that, we explain that another time. But he fixed Mike Scott and gave that guy a heck of a career in the 80s. And he saw something in Johnny that there was some extremely untapped potential there. And he was also, a caring guy, and he was a baseball man, and baseball men like to, they like to fix players as best they can, and he saw something in Johnny that nobody else had seen, and he cultivated that, both as a pitching coach and a manager.
And it's because Johnny had the unfortunate, being there with St. Louis on basically its demise. I mean, they got rid of Red Schoendienst, and I think he's still alive. He's in his 90s, Red. It's
amazing, isn't it? He's one of the last men standing.
Yeah, I mean, he's like 95 years old. He's still around. Now, again, look what we're talking about. We're talking about Red Schoendienst, who, again, took the Cardinals to 2 World Series, I believe.
Yeah.
And, 2 World Series. They lost 1 in 7 to the Tigers, and they won 1 over the Red Sox in '67. Of course, you had prolific gunner Bob Gibson under Red. But here we're dealing with Vern Rapp, and now Vern's taken over the team, and it's being very difficult because he's in the shadow of Red. What's going on between him?
Oh God, yeah, he had a lot to live up to. I mean, he was it's funny, and Johnny and I joke about this every time we start talking about his time at the Cardinals. They used to say this about Ray Hanley, and after he replaced Bill Parcells for the football Giants, you don't want to be the guy who replaces the legend. You want to be the guy who replaces the guy who replaced the legend. And I think that Vern Rapp ran into that. He had such huge shoes to fill, both in terms of Shindy's record as well as the fans' affection. And he was coming from, the background of Sparky Anderson also. I mean, there's 2 people there. He's carrying the legacy of being a disciple of Sparky Anderson, and then he has to replace, the Cardinals' beloved manager for a decade and a half. So, I think that he had a lot on his plate. The Cardinals also had like a surplus of starting pitchers. I mean, they had the ERA king in John Denny. They had Bob Forsch, who was, emerging as a very quality second-tier starter. They had just picked up Larry Dierker from the Houston Astros. They had Eric Rasmussen, who was showing signs of being a solid pitcher. They had Pete Falcone, who had been almost the Rookie of the Year in '75. They had a surplus, and they also had Mike Caldwell, who had an amazing season for the Giants in '74, and Johnny. So they were just so stocked with pitchers and starters, and they had to find places for everyone. And at a certain point, I think they decided that Johnny was the one who was going to be expendable, which is crazy because you look at the game logs for him in St. Louis, and I actually just saw this for the first time. His ERA after his second game was like 2.25. He had 9 strikeouts in 8 innings of 2 starts. And, he was off to a really, really nice start in St. Louis, but they had designs about swapping him probably right when the season began.
And, it's funny because, well, let me ask you this. I've done so many things on Alvin Dark in my podcast, and I make the case, he was from the South. He had that little problem when he mentioned that in the '64, Giants, and it just alienated things about minorities and all this. But as the '70s turned around, Dark now was reborn again Christian. Well, how did Johnny see Alvin Dark as?
He saw Alvin Dark as a very strong Christian. And he saw him as a very strict by-the-book manager. And Alvin Dark kind of, again, rubbed players the wrong way insofar as he didn't like how certain players were living their lives. It was the '70s, and these players were no longer these clean-cut kids. They were guys with, like, long hair and mustache, big hair, as Dan Epstein likes to say, and, they were their mustaches and beards and whatnot. And it was a different time. And one of these things I like to say is, it was the end of the black and white managers that you would see in black and white footage. The Red Schoendienst was gone. Paul Richards was gone. A lot of these other guys that have been around for a while. Ralph Houk was on his way out. So, you saw this was the color era of, Technicolor, if you want to call it, of sports. And you had a lot of of colorful guys, and these old school managers just couldn't really communicate with them properly. It wasn't like Joe Torre was the player manager for 2 months for the Mets in '77, and he was one of the consummate player managers. These guys just weren't able to, and Vern Rapp too, to some degree. They just couldn't relate to these young guys who are hanging out, and they're not all these players were single guys just loving life. A lot of them, were out there and they had roommates, and Johnny at that point had 2 stewardess roommates, and it was a real Three's Company situation, and Dark just did not appreciate that and it didn't care for it. So that became a source of friction between the two of them.
You also get the fiery managers of the decade here. We're talking McGraw-like, John McGraw-like kind of managers in Earl Weaver, Billy Martin. Yeah. Dick Williams has a whole history of winning, from the '67 Red Sox to the Oakland A's. But when I realized, like Billy Martin, he might be a genius, but his mouth always sings him. And here, when we talk about Johnny and Dick Williams, he totally overlooked Johnny at almost every turn and let his emotions get the best of him and just chewed up Johnny regarding this.
Yeah, I don't think that, and not too many other players have really gone into depth on Dick Williams off the field as we do in this book, but. I think there was some pressure for Dick Williams. I mean, remember the Expos had a phenomenal team in '79, and they, by all accounts, they could have really taken the Pirates, but that didn't happen. So, I think there was a lot of pressure on Williams to finally get this team over the top, and they had been young stars for a number of years at that point, and you were starting to see. Andre Dawson was now a full-fledged star. Gary Carter was a full-fledged star. Steve Rogers was a full-fledged ace. So, and Bill Lee had come and had that phenomenal season in '79, and nobody was sure if he could replicate that, and he didn't. But I think there was a lot of pressure on Dick Williams, and he also had his way of dealing with the pressure, and it wasn't always the best way. So, they didn't always get along, and a lot of guys, when things go wrong, they don't say, this one's on me. They don't say, my bad. They say, why did you miss that ground ball? Why did you let that ground ball go through your legs? Or, why did you walk that guy? Or they're blamers. And there was a lot of blaming going on and not necessarily justified. So, and then you mix blaming with some doers on the rocks on an airline flight, things get a little interesting.
And one of the great stories of the book, which I love, I love Bob Gibson. In my mind, he'd be on my starting rotation along with Walter Johnson and a few others. Literally for standing up for himself, Johnny. He earned the respect of Bob Gibson. How great is that?
Yeah. That's a really fun story in the book there that we a lot of people have really enjoyed, and it speaks to the fiery nature of Gibson, but also that Johnny doesn't take any garbage from anyone. And you look at Bob Gibson, his numbers are absolutely incredible. His fielding independent pitching for his career is below 3, which is staggering. His career ERA below 3, 3,000 strikeouts. He's a bona fide Hall of Fame hurler. And when you look at what his situation was, it was 1974, and he was off to a terrible season, and he's pitching his heart out, and he loses to some 22-year-old kid. And it's just, it's frustrating. It's frustrating to see that, and then have Johnny comes in, and Johnny could have said anything, and he did say anything. He said hello, which is basically anything, and Gibson just let him have it verbally, and Johnny said, don't talk to me like that. And then they just, they did their thing.
Now, something, what I like about Johnny here is, like we mentioned, he was a smart guy, He knew that there were certain rights that the players, we aren't treated like chattel. Now, what was his commitment to the players' union? Because back then, a lot of players got involved, and of course, Bob Boone was involved. I know Doug DeCinces was involved. What was Johnny's role here?
Johnny was the co-rep for the California Angels. He was also the co-rep for the Padres. I did some work also. Was the Giants, I believe. He attended a number of meetings, and that's where Marvin Miller began to really gauge his interest. He was someone who was willing to help his teammates. He wanted to be there for his teammates, and it was a very thankless job. There was a moment in the book where Randy Jones says, "Do you want to be co-rep?" And Jones says, "Absolutely, I'd love to help." Marvin told you, "I'll do whatever I can to help you guys out," and then Randy laughs. "It's good because nobody else wants the bleeping job." So it was a lot like that, and Don Baylor was the same way with the Ain't once he got to California. It was basically just to be there and to take care of the players and their grievances and whatnot. And as you'll find out when you really get into the chapters in Fastball John, that Johnny may have paid the ultimate price for his service.
And Johnny had the good fortune of playing with Dave Winfield, who, when he came to the Yankees in 1981, I was totally excited because he was putting up big numbers in San Diego, and Ray Kroc, the McDonald's king, and if you've seen the movie with what's his name, Michael Keaton.
Michael Keaton, yeah, I haven't seen that yet. I'm looking forward to it.
Oh, you see what kind of stealing and stuff. And, all these owners, all the magnates here, they're trying to adjust to free agency and all these mega millions at the time that Steinbrenner's wanted to throw out. I mean, guys before 1976 were getting paid like $10,000 to maybe $200,000 a year, except for Jim Hunter, who had and now comes, because I know you talk about Count Montefusco in there and all the shenanigans that went on there, but now free agency's here. Now Winfield's lighting up the numbers, and as a co-rep for the San Diego Padres, Kroc wants to know Johnny's opinion now. How earth-shattering is that?
Well, it is earth-shattering, but also, San Diego's a small town, relatively speaking, and we are talking in terms of 1979, but it's a small town, and Johnny was a favorite son of San Diego. Plus, he was someone that they trusted because he always put the team first, and he absolutely loved his time in San Diego. Granted, now Johnny is a true blue giant, but he adored his time in his hometown, and the whole Giacosto family was very, very well spoken for in that town. So, and Johnny's an extremely bright guy, and at the time he was also working at Bank of America, so he did have a finance background. So I can understand to some degree why Ray sought his counsel, so to speak. And he was also trying to take the temperature of the clubhouse there. And each ball club has their guys that the owners know, they can ask what's going on down there or whatever without having the players betray the trust of their teammates. And I think Johnny was one of those guys.
And the book gets deeper as his Major League Baseball career ends, and then of course, the guy was pretty much, and then this happens to a few players. Who I speak to sometimes, Willie Mays Aikens. I speak to. He went to jail for the whole cocaine thing in the 1980s, and you speak to a couple. You speak to a couple of ball players and all this, and me being an attorney, it's like, why didn't let's talk about Johnny here. He's going to jail now for pretty much fraud, if I'm not mistaken. He spent like 603 days in jail or something like that. Something he didn't even do.
Yeah. And then that was part of the impetus from Johnny to do this book was that he knows that he was innocent, and we looked into this and we did so much research and we checked and fact checked, and for the most part, he was basically, maybe should he have tried to track down someone at ESPN to tell his story? Should he have gotten in front of Roy Firestone for 60 minutes to explain his side of what was going on? I think maybe. That's a fair point to make. And at this point, he wanted to tell, what happened on his end of these things. And I think that's, a main motivation for the book. Also, Johnny wanted to be extremely creative, and you've seen, if you've seen him on Facebook, you've seen his wonderful works of art, and he's done a beautiful photo of Bryce Harper Arthur, among many other things. He did this beautiful picture of Gary Carter and Yogi Berra at the end of the reign of Shea Stadium, and when they were closing that ballpark. That's absolutely stunning. It's one of my favorite photos that he's done. So Johnny has a creative bent to him, but he also wanted to tell this side of the story, and I think he did a phenomenal job with that.
Now, Johnny, he's into the modern baseball schemes here, the sabermetrics. Now there was no sabermetrics back when he was pitching. How did Johnny get into the more high-tech, things that we have now?
Well, it's funny because Johnny was at the forefront, actually. He worked with a company in the early 90s that engaged in, biomechanics of pitching. And it was kind of the first true analytics of the game. And we don't spend so much time in the book on that, but we allude to it, that Johnny was at the forefront of so much thought. And so it's always been kind of part of him to be involved with such things. So, it makes total sense that he's, there now. Plus, I think that, again, what Johnny mentioned in the book repeatedly was, I always did as I was told. He's a guy who can go in there. He's very congenial. He gets along with everybody. He's an exceptional communicator. And when he went to Major League Baseball and they approached him, they said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "I want to be at the forefront of what's next." And they put him there. And you see, if you watch enough Arizona Diamondbacks games, when there's a when there's a contested call, Johnny comes out with the equipment, and he's right there at the future of Major League Baseball. And if you think about it, that's where he's been for many years.
And, I want to segue from Johnny into an article you just wrote. You sent it to me yesterday. Back then, you've done your research here. You and Johnny wrote such a concrete book of how pitching was. I mean, these guys were like Iron Men, 300 innings a year. They would win 20 to 30 games. Now we're switching to all this sabermetric stuff and pitch counts. And you wrote a brilliant article. We'll probably never see another 300-game winner again because now everything's a pitch count. You watched, I grew up in New York City, right? So I used to watch WPIX with Rizzuto.
Yep.
And I used to watch WOR9 with Kiner
and Bob Murphy and Lindsey Nelson with their sharp sports.
He always had that plaid sports jacket, Lindsey Nelson.
Yeah, I loved it.
I had black and white TV, so I could only see black and white. But, when I listen to a game now, it's like, well, he's up to 20 pitches in an inning and this and that. And the whole dimension of the game now has changed through that. And, I want to know, do you think that, Johnny would thrive in an era if he was coming up now, pretty much like, he could have done back then in the 70s, really?
You know what the tough comp is? I think guys like Johnny or Noah Syndergaard right now, they're pitching. Our kids are pitching so much at the age of 11 and 12. They're not. Johnny played baseball, and then Johnny played football, and then Johnny in the winter rested a little bit, and then he picked up a ball again in February. Kids now, there are all these facilities to play all year round and to pitch all year round. There's indoor infields with mounds where kids go once a week from September, of course after fall ball, from November until January, and they pitch for an hour and a half with a pitching coach. So I don't think that guys threw as many pitches as these kids are throwing now. And I think that's the real problem. And that's why these guys, and plus there's an enormous investment in guys like Matt Harvey or Strasburg or any of these other folks that they don't want to risk their investment because these kids have been throwing since they were 10. And some of them had Tommy John surgery junior year of high school or freshman year of college.
That's crazy.
And I think that's what it is. The kids are just throwing too much, There's a lot of hysteria among parents today about college, and I think that plays into it as well. I see, I have two daughters, and one of them is very active in youth sports, and I see girls that are playing basketball all year round. They're on like 3 or 4 different teams, and they play, they play 5 or 6 games a weekend, and it's just, and it's amazing, and in some circles, kind of concerning that these kids are playing just these sports, because a lot of parents are afraid, how am I going to pay for college? And I think a lot of it stems from that.
Now, let me ask you this. I'm going to give you my final question here. With this book, what did you and Johnny try to leave the reader with when it all comes down to this very well-written, very detailed, very well-researched book? What did you and Johnny want to convey to the reader, and what will be its lasting impression?
Well, the lasting impression, what we wanted to convey ultimately was that no matter how bad things get, if you have a talent or if you have a calling, you don't let the politics interfere with your mission, with your personal mission. Don't let the politics mess up your mojo, so to speak. And we talk about that at the end, is basically keep playing. If you know you're good and there's some coach who's just getting in your way, keep playing. Don't let it get in your head. And there are a couple of times where we talked about with Johnny where there were some managers who may have gotten in his head a little bit. And you'll see that I think that, the lesson he learned was that you just got to do what you have to do and keep playing. And I think that's the lesson in all this, that, Johnny had an absolute world of talent. And when you have a world of talent, don't let others get in the way of that talent. That talent's going to shine through if you allow it to shine through. And that's the major lesson here.
Now, let me ask you this. Such a fantastic written book. Is there going to be Is there going to be sequels to this? What's going on? Is Johnny planning? Because John likes to write. He's written out.
Yeah. Well,
before this. And what's going on now? You have any projects with Johnny coming up?
We're working on a few things. We are talking with a couple publishers, and there may be another one coming, down the line. And we still have a number of stories that we want to tell. And, I guess we haven't been to that game yet. I guess time will tell. But we do have a lot of irons in the fire. So.
Well, I had a great time with you today, Dave. I hope it was well worth it. It
really was.
To be on my show, because I've listened to your podcast, very well done before. I knew that I had to do my homework, like I always do if you listen to my podcast. Really had a great time with you in Fastball John. Hold the line. This is how I end the show, and then I always talk to my authors right after. So hold the line. Folks, as you see, Fastball John is a very, very frankly written, detailed book about a player who's going right through the most turbulent time in Major League Baseball history. You come across all the characters that we talked about tonight, in the 560-something pages. Each page is a page turner. You won't be bored. It's not so lengthy where you're going to be like, oh, my God, when's this going to be end? It's a page turner. It's written almost like a novel, but it's really, really, really happening or happened back then. And I just cannot say enough about it. Go out, get it. As always, I'm your host, Ian Kahanowitz, in from the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. We thank Dave for being on the show. And in the immortal words of Evan Amaro, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.